The room is quiet, but her life isn't. Bills are overdue. Her mother's voice still lingers from a painful argument the night before, and something deep inside her feels like it's slowly falling apart. Yet in that fragile silence, something unseen begins to shift. Lucia sits alone in the dim glow of early morning, a rosary resting uncertainly in her trembling hands, untouched for years, as if forgotten along with the faith she once held onto so tightly. Outside, the world rushes forward without mercy, cars passing, people chasing time, life continuing as if nothing has changed. But inside that small room, everything feels suspended, waiting. She doesn't begin with perfect prayers or sacred words, because she no longer remembers how. What escapes her lips instead is something far more raw, far more human, a broken whisper reaching into the silence, calling for help without knowing if anyone is listening. And yet, beyond what can be seen or understood, a presence draws near, not with force or grandeur, but with a quiet, maternal tenderness that has endured centuries of human suffering without turning away. Virgin Mary remains close, as she always has, watching without judgment, listening without interruption, a silent refuge for hearts that no longer know where to go. Lucia's breath trembles as memories begin to surface, hospital corridors filled with fear, unpaid bills stacking like silent threats, dreams slowly unraveling into uncertainty, and her fingers tighten around the rosary, not yet in faith, but in desperation. Her voice grows steadier, not because the pain has lessened, but because it has finally found its way out. She doesn't ask for miracles, not anymore. She asks for strength to endure, for peace in the chaos, for even the smallest sign that she is not alone in a world that suddenly feels too heavy to carry. At that very moment, across the city, others are fighting their own unseen battles. Raphael stands motionless beside a hospital bed, waiting for news that refuses to come, while Isabel kneels quietly in the dark, whispering prayers through tears she hides from her children. Different lives, different struggles, yet the same silent cry rises from each of them into the same invisible sky. And somehow, those scattered voices begin to weave together, forming something greater than any one person. A quiet chain of longing, of hope, of fragile faith reaching beyond despair. The rosary in Lucia's hands is no longer just an object from the past. It becomes a doorway, an invitation, the first step on a path she does not fully understand, but is willing to walk, because in the deepest exhaustion, when words fail and hope feels distant, there is still one thing left to do, to call out. And sometimes, that call, no matter how soft or broken, is enough to be heard. Something changes after the call, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like the air in the room has softened. Lucia doesn't see anything with her eyes, and yet the heaviness pressing against her chest begins to loosen, just enough for her to breathe a little deeper. The silence around her no longer feels empty, it feels held, as if the space itself has become aware of her pain and refuses to leave her alone inside it. She lowers her head, unsure of what is happening, but unwilling to pull away from it. Across that unseen threshold, a presence draws closer, not as a figure stepping into the room, not as a voice breaking the quiet, but as something far more intimate, a nearness that feels familiar, almost like a memory of being comforted as a child before words were ever needed. Virgin Mary does not arrive to correct or to question. She arrives to remain, to stay beside the trembling heart that has finally dared to open. Lucia's fingers, still wrapped around the rosary, begin to move slowly, almost instinctively, not in perfect rhythm, not guided by ritual, but drawn by a quiet pull she cannot explain. Each bead she touches feels less like a duty and more like an anchor, keeping her from drifting back into the storm inside her mind. Her thoughts, once scattered and loud, begin to settle, not disappearing, but softening, like waves losing their force as they reach the shore. In another part of the city, Raphael leans against a cold hospital wall, his arms crossed tightly, as if holding himself together. The machines inside the room behind him continue their steady, indifferent rhythm, and for a moment, he closes his eyes, not in strength, but because he has run out of options. And in that moment, without knowing why, he feels it too. Not a solution, not an answer, but a presence that does not demand explanations. A quiet assurance that he is seen, even here, in the place where fear usually speaks the loudest. Isabel, miles away, sits at the edge of her bed, the faint glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her whispered prayers falter, not because she lacks faith, but because exhaustion has taken over. She pauses, her voice breaking, expecting the silence to swallow her words. But instead, something meets her there, not visibly, not dramatically, just a gentle stillness that listens, that stays, that does not turn away from her tears. What none of them can see, and yet all of them begin to feel, is the same quiet companionship weaving its way through their separate struggles. Virgin Mary does not move from one place to another like a passing visitor. She is present in each moment where a heart reaches out, even faintly, not to erase suffering, but to stand within it steady, patient, unshaken. Back in the small room, Lucia lifts her head slightly. The weight is not gone. The problems remain, but something inside her has shifted in a way she cannot fully explain. The fear that once filled every corner of her thoughts has lost its sharp edge. In its place is something quieter, something steadier. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of trust. The rosary rests differently in her hands now, no longer just a symbol of something distant or forgotten. It has become a thread connecting her to something beyond herself, something that listens without interruption and remains without condition. Each bead carries not just her words, but her silence, her doubts, her unfinished prayers. And as she sits there, not fully understanding what has begun but unwilling to let go of it, one truth starts to take shape beneath everything else. She is not walking through this alone, not in the noise of her thoughts, not in the weight of her responsibilities, not in the quiet hours when everything feels too much. Because sometimes, the most powerful presence is not the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that stays. The quiet doesn't break, it deepens. What began as a fragile sense of being accompanied now starts to widen, stretching beyond Lucia's small room into something larger than her own story. The rosary in her hands no longer holds only her fears. It begins to gather the weight of other lives, other voices, other unseen battles that echo the same silent plea for help. And without being told, without being instructed, she understands what to do next. She begins to offer them up. Her lips move again, but the words are no longer centered on herself. They rise slowly, deliberately, as if each one carries someone else with it. She whispers a name softly at first, then another, not because she knows how to fix anything, but because she refuses to let those struggles remain isolated in the dark. The act is simple, almost invisible from the outside, yet something profound shifts within it. Pain is no longer held alone. It is lifted. Across the city, Raphael sits in a rigid chair beside a hospital bed, the sterile hum of machines filling the silence between each uncertain breath. His hands are clasped tightly, knuckles pale, as if gripping the last thread of control he has left. He hasn't prayed in years, not since life began to unravel in ways he could not predict or stop. But now, without warning, his thoughts drift not toward solutions, but toward surrender. He doesn't say it out loud, but something inside him releases, just slightly, as if allowing the burden to be carried, even if only for a moment. Miles away, Isabel wipes her tears before they fall too loudly, careful not to wake the children asleep in the next room. She has learned to be strong in silence, to hold everything together even when she feels like she's falling apart. But tonight, something feels different. The exhaustion is still there. The uncertainty hasn't changed. But the loneliness, the sharpest part of it, begins to soften. She leans forward, her hands folded, and for the first time in a long time, she doesn't feel like she's speaking into emptiness. Back in the dim light, Lucia continues, each bead of the rosary becoming a quiet offering. A name, a fear, a wound, a hope. She doesn't try to organize them or make them sound perfect. She simply places them, one by one, into something greater than her understanding. And as she does, The boundaries between her life and the lives of others begin to blur. The struggles that once felt isolated now feel connected, woven together by a shared longing for peace. There is no sudden miracle, no dramatic shift in circumstance. The hospital room remains uncertain. The bills remain unpaid. The answers have not arrived. But something else has begun. Something less visible, yet deeply real. The weight that once pressed inward now starts to move outward, lifted into a space where it does not have to be carried alone. Virgin Mary remains present in that movement not as a distant observer, but as a quiet bearer of what is given. Nothing is dismissed. Nothing is too small, too broken, or too late. Each fear, each whispered name, each silent tear is received without interruption, without judgment, without urgency to resolve, just held. And in that exchange so simple, so hidden, something begins to take root. Not certainty, not answers, but a steadying sense that what has been offered has not been lost. That the act of lifting pain, even without seeing the outcome, carries its own kind of transformation. Lucia pauses for a moment, her fingers resting between beads, her breathing slower now. She doesn't feel finished, but she no longer feels overwhelmed in the same way. The storm inside her has not disappeared, but it has changed direction. It is no longer closing in. It is being released, piece by piece, into something that can hold it, and across the city, without knowing why. Raphael exhales more freely. Isabel closes her eyes without fear. Separate lives, still facing their own realities, yet somehow connected in a way they cannot explain. As if, in the quiet of this unseen moment, their burdens have found a place to rest if only for now. Because sometimes, the turning point doesn't come when problems are solved, but when they are finally placed into hands greater than our own. The room doesn't grow brighter, but something inside it does. What began as scattered whispers and fragile offerings now gathers into a quiet sense of direction, as if the moment itself is asking for something more. Something deeper than emotion, more deliberate than instinct. Lucia's hands rest on the rosary, her breathing steady, her thoughts no longer racing. There is a pause, not empty but expectant, like the threshold of a door she has never opened before, and without fully understanding why. She steps forward, her fingers trace the sign of the cross, slow and intentional, not out of habit but out of need. The gesture feels unfamiliar at first, almost hesitant, but it grounds her, as if drawing a boundary between the noise of the world and the space she has entered. Her lips begin to form words she hasn't spoken in years, words shaped by generations, carried through time, steady and unchanging. They don't come perfectly, but they come honestly, and that is enough. Across the city, Raphael sits in the dim hallway, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the hours stretching without meaning. He doesn't follow a ritual, he doesn't recite anything out loud, but something shifts in the way he sits, the way his shoulders lower slightly, the way his breath deepens. It's not peace, not yet, but it's a movement away from resistance, away from the need to control what cannot be controlled. He leans back just a little, as if allowing space for something beyond himself to enter. In another quiet room, Isabel remains at the edge of her bed, her hands folded tightly, her mind still heavy with unanswered questions. Yet as she sits there, the silence around her changes. It no longer feels like a void pressing in, but like a space that can hold her without collapsing. She doesn't force the words anymore. She lets them come, slowly, imperfectly, trusting that they don't need to be flawless to be heard. Back with Lucia, the rhythm begins to form, not mechanical, not rushed, but steady. Each prayer becomes a step, each word a movement forward into something she cannot see, but is beginning to trust. The familiar structure, once distant and formal, now feels like a path laid out before her, guiding her into a deeper place, where fear does not have the final say. She is no longer reaching blindly. She is entering. Jesus Christ is no longer just a name spoken in passing or remembered from the past. In this moment, he becomes the center of the journey unfolding, not through explanation or argument, but through presence, quiet, steady, undeniable. And alongside him, Virgin Mary remains close, not leading from a distance, but accompanying each step with a patience that does not rush the process. The opening of faith is not dramatic. There is no sudden revelation, no overwhelming certainty. Instead, it unfolds like this through small acts, repeated with sincerity, through a willingness to continue even without answers. The prayers do not remove the reality of suffering, but they begin to reframe it, placing it within something larger, something that does not end in despair. Lucia's voice grows steadier, not louder, but more rooted. The words she speaks now carry intention. They are no longer just reactions to pain, but expressions of a choice to trust, even when understanding is incomplete. And with each passing moment, the distance she once felt between herself and God begins to narrow, not because everything is resolved, but because she has chosen to remain. Raphael shifts in his seat, his gaze no longer fixed in the same rigid way. There is still uncertainty in front of him, still fear that hasn't been answered. But something inside him has stopped fighting the moment. For the first time in hours, he allows himself to simply be there, not bracing, not anticipating, just present. Isabel exhales slowly, her hands loosening as she sits in the quiet. The weight she carries hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines every breath. There is space now, space to hope, even cautiously, space to continue without collapsing under the pressure of what she cannot control. And within all of this, something becomes clear, not through words, but through experience. Faith is not a sudden leap into certainty. It is a doorway, opened slowly, step by step, through moments like these, when the heart chooses to stay, to speak, to trust. Even in the absence of visible change, Lucia continues. The rhythm unbroken now, the path unfolding one prayer at a time. She doesn't know where it will lead. She doesn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, she is no longer standing outside, searching for a way in. She has already crossed the threshold. The rhythm doesn't stop, it deepens. What began as a doorway now becomes a path, and the first step into it carries a weight Lucia can feel without fully understanding. Her fingers move to the next bead, slower this time, as if something within her is asking not just to be spoken, but to be faced. The words begin again, but they are no longer only prayers, they are reflections, invitations, questions waiting for an answer she may not be ready to give. The first mystery opens quietly, almost gently, yet it carries the force of a life-changing moment. A young woman, alone in an ordinary place, is suddenly confronted with something beyond reason, beyond comfort, beyond control. The message is clear, but the cost is not. The future shifts in an instant, and everything she thought her life would be is placed into uncertainty. And yet, in that moment, she speaks a single word that echoes through time, not out of ease, but out of trust. Lucia doesn't see the scene as a distant story. She feels it pressing against her own life, because the question beneath it is not ancient, it is immediate. What happens when life asks for something she didn't plan for? What happens when the path ahead makes no sense? When the outcome is unclear? When the fear is real? Across the city, Raphael stares through the hospital window, his reflection faint against the glass. The decisions in front of him don't feel like choices. They feel like losses waiting to happen. There is no good option, no clear direction, only the quiet pressure of responsibility. He exhales slowly, his jaw tightening, knowing that whatever he decides, something will change, something will be risked, something will be surrendered. Miles away, Isabel sits with her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts circling the same question she has asked herself for days. What if things don't get better? What if the situation doesn't resolve the way she hopes? The fear is not loud. It's persistent, steady, wearing her down from the inside. And yet, beneath that fear, something else begins to surface, not certainty, but a quiet invitation to trust beyond what she can see. Back in the dim room, Lucia pauses between breaths, her fingers still on the bead. The mystery is no longer just unfolding in words, it is unfolding in her. Because the heart of it is not about understanding everything. It is about responding when understanding is incomplete. Virgin Mary did not receive a full explanation. There was no detailed plan, no guarantees of ease, no promise that the path ahead would be free of pain. What was given was a moment, a decision point, where fear and faith stood side by side. And in that moment, she chose to say yes. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because she trusted the one who was asking. Lucia feels the weight of that word yes. It is small, almost fragile, yet it carries more power than resistance ever could. She realizes that her own life has been filled with moments where she has said no to uncertainty, no to surrender, no to anything that threatened her sense of control. And now, faced with everything she cannot fix, she begins to see another option, not to understand it all, but to respond differently. Her voice is quieter now, but steadier. The prayer continues, but something within it has changed. It is no longer just asking for things to be removed or resolved. It is beginning to ask for the strength to accept, to trust, to move forward even without clarity. Raphael shifts slightly, his grip loosening just enough to let the tension ease from his hands. He doesn't name it, doesn't define it, but something inside him stops fighting the moment as fiercely. The need to control every outcome begins to soften, replaced by a willingness, however small, to face what comes next. Isabel closes her eyes, her breathing slowing, as the question that once felt overwhelming becomes something else. Not gone, but transformed. Instead of asking why, she begins to ask how to endure, to continue, to trust, even when the answers remain out of reach. And within all of them, the same quiet movement takes place, not dramatic, not visible, but real. The shift from resistance to openness, from fear of the unknown to a willingness to step into it. Because the first mystery is not just about a moment in history. It is about every moment where life asks for a response before clarity arrives. Every moment where control slips away and trust becomes the only path forward. Lucia exhales slowly, her fingers moving to the next bead, her heart no longer standing still at the threshold. She hasn't solved anything. Nothing around her has changed. But something within her has taken its first real step. And sometimes, that step, the quiet, trembling yes, is where everything begins. The next beat doesn't feel the same. The yes still lingers, but it no longer sits still, it moves. What began as surrender now begins to take shape as action, quiet but undeniable, like a current pulling the heart forward. Lucia's fingers continue along the rosary, and with them, something within her shifts from inward reflection to outward movement. The path is no longer only about what she carries. It's about where she's being led. The second mystery unfolds not in stillness, but in motion. A young woman, newly entrusted with something sacred, doesn't remain where she is. She rises. She leaves the safety of what is known and steps into the unknown, not because she has everything figured out, but because love refuses to stay still. There is distance to cross, uncertainty ahead, and no promise of ease, only the quiet urgency to go. Lucia feels that tension immediately, because movement, especially when life is already heavy, feels impossible. Her world hasn't slowed down. The bills still wait, the wounds are still open, and yet beneath all of it, there is a question she can't ignore. What if love is not just something to receive, but something to carry forward? Across the city, Raphael stands outside the hospital room, staring at the door he has been avoiding. Inside, someone is waiting not just for answers, but for presence. He knows it. He feels it. But stepping inside means facing fear directly, without the shield of distance. For a moment, he hesitates, his hand hovering near the handle. Then, without fully resolving the fear, he moves. Not because he feels strong, but because staying away feels heavier than going in. Miles away, Isabel sits at her kitchen table, the quiet of early morning surrounding her. The exhaustion hasn't left, and neither has the uncertainty. But something from the night before remains, a small, steady shift she can't quite explain. Her phone rests nearby, untouched. There's someone she hasn't called, someone who needs more than silence, more than distance. She stares at the screen for a long moment, her thoughts pulling in opposite directions. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she reaches for it. Back in the dim room, Lucia's breathing deepens as the mystery unfolds within her. The movement she senses isn't dramatic. It's not about changing everything at once. It's about a single step outward, towards someone else. Even when her own life feels unresolved, Virgin Mary did not wait for perfect conditions before she went. There was no guarantee of understanding, no certainty about what would happen next. But what she carried was not meant to remain hidden. It was meant to be shared, to be brought into the lives of others, even if the journey required effort, risk, and trust. Lucia realizes how often she has waited to feel better, waited for life to stabilize, waited for the right moment before reaching out. But that moment never fully arrives. And now, faced with a quiet pull to move, she begins to understand something different. Love doesn't wait for everything to be resolved. It moves anyway. Her fingers tighten slightly around the rosary, not out of fear, but out of focus. The prayer continues, but it feels more alive now, more connected to the world beyond her room. She begins to think of specific faces, specific needs, not abstract suffering, but real people she has kept at a distance. And for the first time, the idea of reaching out doesn't feel like an obligation. It feels like a response. Raphael opens the door. The sound is soft, almost unnoticed. But the moment is not. He steps inside, his movements careful, uncertain, yet present. He doesn't have the right words. He doesn't have answers. But he shows up. And somehow, that is enough to shift the weight in the room, even if only slightly. Isabel presses the call button. The phone rings once, twice, and for a moment she considers hanging up, retreating back into silence. But she doesn't. She waits. And when the voice on the other end answers, her own voice follows, not perfect, not rehearsed, but real. Lucia lowers her head slightly, her heart no longer focused only on what she needs, but on what she can give, even in small ways. The path ahead is still uncertain, her life still unresolved, but the direction is clearer now. Not inward, not stuck, but forward. Because the second mystery is not about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It is about movement, simple, intentional, often uncomfortable movement toward others. It is about choosing connection over isolation, presence over avoidance, love over hesitation. And sometimes, that movement begins with something as small as a step toward a door, a hand reaching for a phone, or a heart willing to go where it once refused. Lucia's fingers move to the next bead, her pace steady, her direction set. She doesn't know how far this path will take her. She doesn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, she is no longer standing still. The movement doesn't stop. It narrows, focusing into something quieter, more fragile, yet more powerful than anything before it. Lucia's fingers slow on the next bead, as if the rhythm itself is asking her to pay closer attention. The path she has stepped onto now leads somewhere unexpected, not into strength, not into control, but into a place where everything appears small, exposed, and unfinished. The third mystery opens in contrast to everything the world calls success. No grand entrance, no perfect setting, just a moment hidden in obscurity, where light enters quietly, almost unnoticed. A child is born not into comfort, not into certainty, but into a space marked by limitation, vulnerability, and need. And yet, that is exactly where everything begins. Lucia feels the tension immediately, because nothing in her life feels ready for anything new. The problems she carries haven't resolved. The fear hasn't disappeared. If anything, the reality of her situation feels even more exposed now that she has stopped running from it. And yet, this mystery doesn't point to escape, it points to something else entirely. The possibility that what feels insufficient may not be empty after all. Across the city, Raphael sits beside the hospital bed, the steady rhythm of the monitor filling the silence. There are no updates, no breakthroughs, just waiting. The kind of waiting that strips away control, leaving only presence behind. He watches the rise and fall of each breath, aware of how little he can change. And for the first time, instead of resisting that helplessness, he remains there within it, without turning away. Miles away, Isabel stands in her kitchen, the early light just beginning to break through the window. The phone call from earlier still echoes in her mind, not solving everything, but shifting something inside her. The weight of responsibility hasn't lifted. The questions are still there. But as she moves slowly through the quiet routine of the morning, she notices something different, not the absence of struggle, but a quiet steadiness within it. Back in the dim room, Lucia lowers her gaze, her grip on the rosary gentler now. The mystery unfolding before her doesn't promise immediate change. It doesn't offer solutions or relief. Instead, it presents something more difficult to accept: that light does not wait for perfect conditions to appear. It enters exactly where things are incomplete. Jesus Christ is not born into ease, but into limitation, not into control, but into dependence. And somehow, within that vulnerability, something greater is revealed, not through power, but through presence. The kind of presence that does not avoid brokenness, but chooses to exist within it. Lucia feels something shift again, quieter this time, but deeper, because she has spent so long believing that things needed to be fixed before anything good could begin. That peace required resolution, that hope depended on change. But this moment challenges that entirely. It suggests that something real, something lasting can begin even when everything feels uncertain. Her breathing steadies as the thought settles. The problems are still there. The uncertainty remains. But they no longer feel like barriers to something better. Instead, they become the very place where something new can take root. Raphael leans forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes no longer scanning for answers that haven't come. He doesn't know what will happen next, but the urgency to control the outcome has softened. What remains is something simpler: being there, fully present, even when the situation offers no clarity. Isabel pauses by the window, her hands resting against the counter as she looks out at the quiet street. The day ahead will still bring its challenges. Nothing has been resolved overnight, but she no longer feels as though she is standing at the edge of collapse. There is space now, small, but real, where something steady can grow. Lucia's fingers move again, slowly, deliberately, her voice continuing with a quiet strength that wasn't there before. The prayer has changed, not in words, but in meaning. It is no longer a search for escape, but an openness to what can begin even here, even now. Because the third mystery does not remove hardship, it redefines it. It reveals that what appears weak may hold something stronger than anything built on certainty. That what feels small may carry something far greater than anything visible. And sometimes, the most unexpected truth is this: that light doesn't wait for life to become perfect before it appears. It chooses the moment when everything feels least prepared and begins anyway. Lucia lifts her head slightly, her eyes steady now, not because everything is clear, but because something within her no longer depends on clarity to continue. The path moves forward, not into resolution, but into something deeper, and for the first time, she doesn't resist it. The quiet strength that has begun to grow does not remain. Still, it asks for something more. Not louder prayers, not stronger emotions, but a deeper kind of release. Lucia's fingers pause briefly on the next bead, as if the journey itself is inviting her to loosen her grip on everything she has been holding so tightly. The path has led her through fear, through movement, through the realization that light can exist even in brokenness. But now it brings her to something harder: letting go. The fourth mystery unfolds, not in chaos, but in surrender. A moment where what is most precious is not hidden, not protected, but offered. There is no resistance, no attempt to negotiate, no effort to keep something back just in case. Everything is placed forward, not because it is easy, but because love trusts beyond what it can secure. Lucia feels the weight of that immediately, because surrender, for her, has never been simple. She has spent so long trying to hold everything together, managing problems, protecting what little stability remains, keeping control where she can. Letting go doesn't feel like faith. It feels like risk. It feels like stepping into uncertainty without knowing what will be returned. Across the city, Raphael stands by the hospital bed, the stillness of the room heavier than before. The moment he has been avoiding is now in front of him, not a decision he can delay, not something he can pass to someone else. The reality settles in. There are things he cannot fix, outcomes he cannot guarantee. His hands, once clenched, now rest open at his sides. Not because he feels ready, but because holding on no longer changes anything. Slowly, without ceremony, he releases the need to control what comes next. Miles away, Isabel sits at her kitchen table, her thoughts no longer racing, but circling something quieter, more difficult to face. She has carried everything alone for so long: responsibility, fear, expectations. And the idea of placing any of it outside herself feels unfamiliar, almost unnatural. And yet, as the silence stretches, she feels a quiet invitation not to give up, but to give over, to stop carrying everything, as if it depends entirely on her strength. Back in the dim room, Lucia's breathing slows, her fingers resting lightly on the rosary. The mystery before her is not asking her to abandon her life or ignore her responsibilities. It is asking something more precise: to release the belief that everything depends on her ability to hold it all together. Virgin Mary did not keep anything back. What she was given, uncertain, vulnerable, filled with a future she could not fully see, was offered completely, not out of loss, but out of trust, not out of weakness, but out of a strength that chooses surrender over control. Lucia feels that truth settle into her, not as a command, but as a possibility, because she realizes how much of her exhaustion has come from holding on to outcomes, to expectations, to the need for things to unfold a certain way. And now, faced with everything she cannot secure, she begins to see another path: not to abandon what matters, but to place it somewhere beyond her own limits. Her hands loosen slightly, the rosary no longer gripped, but held. The difference is small, almost invisible, but it changes everything, because the act of holding has shifted from control to trust. Raphael exhales slowly, the tension in his body releasing in a way he doesn't fully notice. He still doesn't know what will happen. The situation hasn't changed, but the weight of needing to control it all has lifted, even if only partially. What remains is presence, quiet, steady, enough. Isabel lowers her gaze, her hands resting calmly now, no longer clenched around thoughts that refuse to resolve. The pressure to carry everything perfectly begins to fade, replaced by something more sustainable: acceptance that she does not have to do it all alone. Lucia's voice continues, softer now, but more grounded. The prayer is no longer reaching outward in desperation. It is placing things down carefully, intentionally, one by one. Not discarding them, not denying them, but entrusting them, because the fourth mystery is not about losing what matters. It is about recognizing that what matters most was never meant to be carried alone. And sometimes, the deepest form of strength is not in holding on tighter, but in knowing when to release, when to place everything into hands that can hold far more than we ever could. Lucia moves to the next bead, her heart quieter now, not because everything is solved, but because something within her has finally stopped trying to control what cannot be controlled. The path continues, not lighter, but freer. And for the first time, that feels like enough. The stillness after surrender doesn't end the journey, it reveals what has been hidden beneath it. Lucia's fingers reach the next bead, and for a brief moment, everything inside her feels exposed again. Not chaotic like before, not overwhelming in the same way, but clear, honest. As if letting go has made space for something she has quietly avoided for a long time. The path doesn't move forward without first passing through this place, the place of absence. The fifth mystery opens not with certainty, but with loss. A moment where something deeply loved is suddenly missing, and the silence it leaves behind is louder than anything before. There is no explanation, No immediate answer, only the realization that what once felt close now feels distant. And the search begins. Lucia feels it immediately, not as a story, but as a reflection. Because there have been moments more than she has admitted when she felt disconnected, not just from peace, but from meaning itself. Times when prayer felt empty, when hope seemed like something that belonged to other people, not her. And even now, in the quiet that has begun to form, there is still a question lingering beneath everything. What if that closeness fades again? Across the city, Raphael sits in the hospital room, the steady rhythm of the monitor unchanged. The waiting has stretched into something that feels almost unreal, as if time itself has slowed without resolution. He has done everything he can. He has stayed. He has faced what he feared. And yet there is still no clear answer. The silence now feels different, not as sharp, but heavier, as if pressing him to confront what he cannot fix. Miles away, Isabel walks slowly through her home, the early light now fully filling the space. The phone call, the quiet moments, the small shift she felt, they haven't disappeared, but they haven't resolved everything either. There is still uncertainty, still questions, and in the quiet between one moment and the next, she feels it, the subtle fear that what she found might not last. Back in the dim room, Lucia lowers her head again, her grip on the rosary steady but gentle. The mystery unfolding before her does not avoid this tension. It brings it forward. It acknowledges what so many try to ignore, that there are moments when connection feels lost, when clarity disappears, when even faith feels distant. Virgin Mary knew that feeling, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality. The absence was real. The searching was urgent. There was no immediate reassurance, no quick resolution, only the decision to keep looking, to keep moving, to refuse to settle into the silence as if it were the end. Lucia feels something steady in that truth, because the fear of losing what she has begun to find has been sitting quietly beneath everything else. And now, instead of avoiding it, she begins to see it differently, not as a sign that something is wrong, but as part of the journey itself. Her breathing deepens, her thoughts no longer racing to avoid the discomfort, because the search, the act of continuing, even when clarity fades, is not failure. It is movement, it is commitment, it is the refusal to let distance become permanent. Raphael shifts slightly in his seat, his eyes no longer scanning for change, but resting. The uncertainty remains. The outcome is still unknown, but something within him has stopped expecting immediate answers. He remains, not because everything is clear, but because leaving is no longer an option. Isabel pauses by the window again, her gaze steady, her posture no longer tense. The questions are still there, but they no longer feel like threats. They feel like something she can carry, even without resolution, because what she has found is not dependent on everything going right. It is something deeper, something that can remain even when clarity does not. Lucia's fingers move slowly along the rosary, her voice quieter now, but more grounded than before. The prayer continues, not as a search for certainty, but as an act of staying present, staying open, staying willing to continue, even when the path feels unclear. Because the fifth mystery is not only about loss, it is about what follows the decision to search, to persist, to believe that what feels distant is not gone forever, that what has been found once can be found again. And sometimes, the most powerful moment is not when everything is clear, but when the search continues anyway. Lucia lifts her head slightly, her eyes steady, her heart no longer shaken by the possibility of absence. She understands something now that she didn't before, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to keep going. The path does not end here. It deepens. And this time, she does not turn back. The final bead arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, yet everything within it feels complete, not finished in the way problems disappear, not resolved in the way life suddenly becomes easy, but complete in a deeper, steadier sense. Lucia's hands come to rest, the rosary now still, her breathing calm in a way it hasn't been for a long time. The room hasn't changed. The world outside continues exactly as before. And yet, Something inside her is no longer the same. The fear that once filled every corner of her thoughts has softened into something she can carry without breaking. The weight she held so tightly has been placed, not removed, but entrusted. The questions remain, but they no longer demand immediate answers. Instead, they rest within a quiet confidence that she is not facing them alone. Across the city, Raphael sits beside the hospital bed, his posture no longer rigid. The uncertainty has not lifted, but neither has he. He remains steady, present, no longer fighting the moment but living within it. And somehow, that presence carries a strength he didn't know he had. Isabel stands by the window as the day fully unfolds, her reflection faint in the glass. The future is still unclear, but the fear of it has lost its grip. What remains is a quiet resolve, a willingness to continue, to trust, to take each step without needing to see the entire path ahead. And within all of them, the same unseen reality holds steady Virgin Mary present not as a distant figure, but as a mother who remains close, covering what is fragile, steadying what is uncertain, holding what feels too heavy to carry alone, not removing every storm, but standing within it, offering a shelter that cannot be shaken. Lucia lifts her head, her eyes clear now, not because everything has been answered, but because something deeper has taken root, peace that does not depend on circumstances, strength that does not come from control, and hope that does not fade in the dark. And maybe that's the truth most people are searching for, not a life without struggle, but a heart that can remain steady through it. If this story spoke to you, if you felt even a moment of that quiet peace, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Mary's Light in the Darkness and continue walking this journey one prayer, one step, one light at a time.